Hey, welcome. We're in book number 1. Today we're going to look at the sayings of Jesus along with parables. So let's pull up this screen. Okay, the sayings of Jesus. So you see right there in the middle of the page, it just says Jesus was a master teacher. He knew how to communicate his message in such a way that the old, the young, the rich, the poor, highly educated, Pharisees, and common people without education could all understand him. He communicated with such skill and authority that on more than one occasion, people heard him. They were astonished. They were asking questions. Where did he get this learning? How could this man that has no have this learning when he's never studied? That's John's Gospel 7:15. So Jesus is a master storyteller. He never tired of confronting the Jewish religious leaders with insightful stories or appropriate counter questions to their many questions. The crowds loved to sit and listen to Jesus speak for hours at a time, and they remembered what he said. The sayings of Jesus, as well as the teachings and events of his life, were compiled. They were written by the gospel writers, which we have these today. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. As a master teacher, as with any teacher today, he's going to use many different ways to communicate his sayings, his teachings, to get his point across. One of the major ways Jesus communicated was through what we call figures of speech. Figure of speech is a way to say something in a figurative or a non-literal sense. It's a way to communicate a message in a distinctive way so that it's remembered more easily. So let's look at some of these figures of speech. One is exaggeration. An exaggeration is overstating the obvious, saying more than what is really meant. So here's a couple examples that they give here. Jesus said, "Why do you see the speck in your brother's eye? Why do you see that little tiny speck, but you do not notice the log in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, 'Let me take the speck out of your eye,' when there is a log in your own eye?" And Jesus says, "You hypocrite. First take out the log from your own eye, then you'll see clearly to take out the speck out of your brother's eye." So obviously this is an exaggeration. Nobody's walking around with a big physical log in his or her eye. That's not happening. So Jesus is exaggerating. He's overemphasizing to make a point. So this isn't to be taken literally. Then the first century, people walked around with giant logs in their eye. And he's not talking about specks, eyes, or logs at all, but rather he's making a point to not be so quick, for you and I to be so quick to see the fault in somebody else's life when we have big faults within our own lives. The overall context of Matthew 7:1-5 makes this point clear. Second is hyperbole. Hyperbole is a deliberate, extreme overstatement, but excessive exaggeration to make a point. So Jesus did this in this story. He says, if your right eye causes you to sin, he says, tear it out, throw it away. For it's better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown in hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, he says, cut it off, throw it away. For it's better for you to lose one of your members than your whole body go into hell. So I'm guessing in your culture, Bible believing Christians, there's not a whole lot of them walking around missing an eye or missing a hand. So they probably aren't taking this literally, nor is Jesus is his purpose for us to take this literally. He does have a point here, though. He's not talking about cutting off your hand. He's not talking about tearing out your eye. But what he's saying when you see this extreme exaggeration is that, hey, this is very serious. I need to take sin very seriously. And I need to do something about sin, because sin can indeed lead a person to hell. The overall context of Matthew 5:29 and 30, and the greater context of 21 through 48 makes this point clear. Individuals in Jesus' day, they thought, well, if I just keep the letter of the law, if I don't commit any actual adultery, they weren't sinners. I could lust, I could have wrong thoughts, I could hate people, I could do all these things. And Jesus says, no, you're missing the point of the law. Jesus also used counter question. It's a method of arguing or debating where a question is used to answer a previous question or reply. Jesus especially enjoyed using this counter question when the Jewish leaders asked him a question. Matthew 12:11 and 12. Man was there with a withered hand, and they asked him, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? So that they might accuse him. And he said, which of you, here's the counter question, which of you who has a sheep falls into a pit on the Sabbath will not take hold of it and lift it out? So why is Jesus asking this question? He's answering the question with his own question. And if we look in the context, it makes it clear that Jesus wants the religious leaders to think more deeply about the law, to reflect on it. Sabbath and helping human beings, and his counter question is followed up by healing of the man with the withered hand. Proverb, and we're going to go a little bit deeper in this in a little bit. But a proverb is a short, compact saying that contains a truth that is worth remembering. When Jesus speaks a proverb, we don't know if he is quoting an already well-known proverb or he was making one up of his own. Either way, the point is try to understand what is the truth in that proverb. That's the part we need to remember. Here's an example. When Jesus heard it, he said to them, those who are well do not have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. Another one. Jesus said, no one puts his hand to the plow and looks back is fit for the kingdom of God. So in both these examples, again, we don't know, is he quoting an already well-known proverb, or is he making this up on the spot? But the context, the overall context, shows Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners, much to the frustration of the religious leaders who asked his disciples, why does he eat with such individuals? And Jesus replies, two parts. Those who are well, they have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. And the second part, he comments on the proverb, I came not to call the righteous, but sinners. In this case, his comments on the proverb explain the proverb's point. Luke 9:62, Jesus gives the proverb without comment. The overall context is the cost involved in following Jesus, of which this proverb forms a conclusion. The point of the proverb is seen in the overall context. If anyone wants to follow Jesus, can't be distracted by the things of the world. Kingdom of God must have priority. 3 points in interpreting the sayings of Jesus. First of all, figures of speech are universal. The beauty of Jesus' use of figures of speech is that the majority of cultures and languages today, we still use figures of speech. Think about the figures of speech within your own culture. Determine the type of figure of speech is being used. So we have to look at some major types of figures of speech Jesus uses. There are others, and your own familiarity with how language works in your own culture will help you identify these others as well. Again, knowing the kind of figure of speech that Jesus is using in a particular saying will go a long way and help you understand and interpret what Jesus is saying. Again, this is not new here. Determine the contextual boundaries. We've talked about this in step 2 in the 7 steps. The contextual boundaries are important when we're trying to interpret the sayings of Jesus. Is it in a larger context? Has he already taught something else? Has he been asked a question? So you want to look at all these different things and say, does this story fit into that context, which then helps us interpret the parable. So again, review questions. Why is knowing that Jesus is a master teacher in his own time, how is that helpful in understanding Jesus in your time period? Why is understanding the various types of figures of speech helpful as we interpret the sayings of Jesus? Seeing the Bible come alive, they're going to give you a task to do here. So read Matthew 7, 3 through 5. Pay attention to the figures of speech that Jesus is using. Do Bible interpretation in this passage. Remember our reading strategies, that's steps 1 through 4. Our relating strategies, steps 5 through 7. They're going to list them out for you. Hopefully by now you are memorizing these 7 steps, because we're going to go through them no matter what we're interpreting. All right, we're going to zoom in on the parables of Jesus. So one of his most effective ways in communicating was through parables. He told parables to all kinds of people, to his disciples, to religious leaders, to the crowds, to regular people. Now, why did he teach in parables? And one thing that's not listed in here is sometimes he's teaching in parables to reveal a particular truth. And then we do have some passages where he's concealing something. And it's not concealed as in the sense that everybody would be blind to it. But those that are not really interested in following him, it's not going to make sense. So Jesus taught in parables because everybody enjoys these good stories. At its heart, the parable is a simple story, but it's more than a story. It's a story that's trying to make a point. The very word parable means a story that's making a point through comparison. In many ways, a parable is just an extended or a longer simile, similar to those that we studied in previous chapters. A lot of Jesus' public teaching was through parables. As a result, it's important for church planters, disciple makers, and pastors to know how to interpret Jesus' parables. So 5 points about parables. Parables come from everyday lives of people. He talked about common things. People know what it's like to lose something, like a lost coin, or to attend an event like a wedding. Most cultures understand sowing seed in a field or dishonest managers. So Jesus is going to use these examples from everyday life to teach biblical principles. All right, if you're going through the parable, look for a main point. We've already read from above, the parable is a story trying to make a point. As a result, it's important for those trying to interpret the parable to look for that main point. Sometimes the main point is a comparison. It's easy to find, especially if Jesus is talking about the kingdom of God, he's making a point. Other times it's more difficult. 3 is important. The details are not important. Don't get bogged down in all the details and trying to think that every little detail means something. Stay focused on the bigger picture. 4, understand the purpose of the parable for both Jesus and the gospel writer. So when we interpret the parable of Jesus, we can more accurately interpret them by looking at both what Jesus had in mind for his original audience when he originally spoke the parable, as well as looking at what the gospel writer had in mind when he remembered or he recorded or his placement in the gospel of that story. In other words, Jesus had a reason why he spoke the parable to his original audience, and the gospel writer had a reason why he remembered or recorded that. 5 parables are stories. Since parables are stories, it's helpful to treat them in the same way we learned how to interpret stories the chapter before. Consequently, with parables, it's also helpful to look at what, when, where, who, and why questions. What's going on in the parable? When this happened? Where? Who? Why is this story being told? And this is especially important in steps 2, 3, and 4 of the 7 steps. All right, review. Why is it important to look for the main points of the parable and not get distracted by all the details that might also be found in the parable? Why is it necessary to look at how the gospel writer used the parable for his own audience? How does your own community of believers hear and tell parables? And here's an assignment. Just go ahead and go through this with Matthew 25, 1 through 13. Use those steps. And again, reading strategy steps 1 through 4, relating strategy steps 5 through 7. They have them all laid out for you right there. All right, be blessed and enjoy interpreting parables.